For decades, economic sanctions were the butt of just about every interstate coercion joke, thanks in large part to long-running campaigns against North Korea, Iran, Iraq, and Cuba that all failed to beat their targets into submission. However, sanctions have recently received a bit of a public resurgence, thanks in no small part due to their critical role mitigating Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And then, as if to reinforce that, the emergence of the Gaza crisis placed new emphasis on Israel's almost 2-decade-long effort to blockade the Strip. Nevertheless, some of the most basic principles of economic sanctions are not well understood. That is why today we are going to cover the very basics of how economic sanctions manipulate a government's budgeting decision. Thus, I am not going to cover the complicated macroeconomic effects of economic sanctions, or the finer points of specific targets and destabilization strategies, or how they fit into the broader coercive picture. To the contrary, instead we are going to put ourselves into the shoes of a leader who just got hit with sanctions, and figure out how they will respond with their budgeting decisions. Because nothing is better for my retention metrics than more images of spreadsheets, or the word fungible for that matter. Hey, remember the good old days when NFTs were not a thing, and no one had heard of the word fungible before? Anyway, in our search for answers, we are going to see 3 things. First, sanctions that target a country's military capacity are much stronger than they appear. So if you are a rival country that wants to go all Dark Brandon on your opponent, this is a really good place to start. Second, sanctions that target a country's overall economic welfare are blunt, inefficient tools. So if you are a rival country, it is helpful, but still far from the ideal case. And third, sanctions relief for humanitarian purposes does not have the effect it seems to have at all. Namely, that our default expectation should be that when you release a bunch of money that indeed directly goes toward humanitarian needs, you end up implicitly funding the thing that you do not like. Obviously, this is an unfortunate reality, and if we have to assign blame, it is to that silly fungible word from earlier. But we begin by substantively grounding what each type of sanction is. The first 2 have been central parts of the Western response to the Ukraine situation. Looking at the big picture, before the war, Russia was 3rd in arms exports in the world, only to the United States and to France. Nevertheless, Russian arms manufacturers still relied on Western imports to assemble their finished products. The most well-known of these problems involved semiconductors, which are necessary components of just about all modern electronics. Russia struggled for years to manufacture its own, and many companies that attempted to do so ultimately went bankrupt. Those that did survive produced low-quality semiconductors, and ironically, those companies relied on Western imports as well for their manufacturing processes. The whole debacle created a critical vulnerability in the Fortress Russia strategy. As a result, sanctions hit Russia hard here. Prior to the invasion, Russia imported more semiconductors from Germany than any other country. That got shut down immediately. The United States ranked 3rd on Russia's import list, but also terminated that relationship. Taiwan dominates the global market, but was not willing to help out. The result is not that it has become impossible for Russia to manufacture arms that use semiconductors, just that it has become expensive to use intermediaries like China, previously number 2 on Russia's import list, or inefficient to cannibalize things like household appliances to source them. The second half of the sanctions regime has aimed to decimate the Russian economy. The most public component of this has been to kill imports of Russian energy. There was also the embarrassing moment at the beginning of the war, when the United States and the European Central Bank froze Russian accounts, thereby locking $300 billion in place. Now, literal rubles were never going to march into Kyiv to take over the country, though that is a humorous mental image. But those rubles can pay for those arms manufacturers to work overtime to get one more off of the assembly line, and the accumulation of metal can capture cities. However, governments also need to keep up some level of social spending, otherwise they risk facing an uprising at home. Shrinking the budget therefore forces some tough decisions on where to allocate what remains. For the third type of sanctions question, we have to break out from the Russia-Ukraine case for lack of prominent examples there. But there are two other recent conflicts with prominent discussions of humanitarian exemptions. First, fuel is an ongoing concern with Israel's blockade of the Gaza Strip. This is not just a problem for those with the luxury of owning a car. Fuel is also needed to cook food. But at an even more basic level, Gaza needs fuel to run its desalination plants. Otherwise, the Strip will not have sufficient water to drink. Meanwhile, the United States recently reached an agreement with Iran along these lines. Following the release of 5 American prisoners, the United States announced that it would free about $6 billion in Iranian assets. This came with a provision that the money could only go toward humanitarian ventures. Iran's president was adamant that it was Iran's money, and therefore Iran would do whatever it wants with it. Meanwhile, the White House insisted that the cash would be tightly regulated and only go toward civilian considerations. So then, who is right? Ultimately, we will see that the answer is both. Kind of. Regardless, this type of exemption is common. Even during the peak of the sanctions regime against Saddam Hussein, the UN ran something called the Oil for Food program, and you can tell how old it is based on how pixelated that logo is. Yikes. This was the Clinton administration's idea to solve the deteriorating humanitarian conditions within Iraq. It allowed Saddam Hussein to go to the international market and trade oil for, you guessed it, food. More on that later. Now for a fair warning about what is upcoming. I am not going to be pulling any punches for the rest of this video. We are going to be doing this with the real math. But I still want to give you an idea of what is happening for each of these sanction strategies before we get there. To be clear, the math provides some important nuance, which is why we are going to be doing it in a moment. But here are the key takeaways. When you sanction production, weapons become more expensive. Thus, holding fixed the amount spent on weapons, the target builds fewer of them. But it gets better because spending money on expensive weapons looks less attractive. So you get less spent on weapons, which means yet less power gets produced. That makes it the best way to sanction an opponent. Regarding economic destruction, you do indeed get military spending to go down. But when you look toward the social programs, the lower overall budget does a number to them as well, simply because there is less money to go around. So the sanctioner gets some good, but also some bad. It's inefficient. Finally, the problem with humanitarian exemptions is that the money released, that can only be spent for humanitarian purposes, takes the money that the government would have otherwise spent for such purposes, and frees it. Thus, the extra money flows to the weapons. The math will show that there are ways to get out of this, but that they are not easy. This is why states are not exactly eager to grant them. I do not think it is a happy thing either, but please don't shoot the messenger. Okay, now let's see how these sanctions actually play out when it comes to budgeting decisions. Put yourself in the shoes of a world leader. You have a bunch of money, and it is time to set that budget. Broadly, you can burn the cash on two things. First, the bad stuff, which I will shorthand as just weapons, but could also represent general political graft that an outside country wants to discourage. And second, social spending. Even militarily focused countries have to pour some money into the latter, lest the leader gets swept away in a domestic rebellion. That is why, for example, the Kremlin has come to view pension payments as untouchable, and the Russian government will lose more than $4 billion this year to subsidize domestic gasoline sales. Actually, Russia's official 2024 budget allocates 40% of the money to security, which is a record high, but that still leaves 60% elsewhere. Speaking about the problem generally, the more you spend on each of these, the happier you are. The problem is that your budget is finite, and the more you spend on one, the less you spend on the other. Thus, the difficult trade-off for any leader is to figure out how to best allocate your cash. The other important thing is that there are diminishing marginal returns on investments for either purpose. For example, going from your 9th F-16 to your 10th is more important than going from your 99th to your 100th. Okay, let's put all of this together using some math. Yay. Now, I know that there is a temptation to tune out as soon as the numbers come in, but bear with me for 1 minute. I will try to make this as painless as possible. Suppose that the variable B is your budget, and the variable M is how much you spend on the military. We will need to have sanctions manipulate the spending on the military in a moment, so imagine that T is the cost of each tank, or whatever it is. As such, M divided by T is the actual tank production. For example, if a tank costs $4 million, and you spend $100 million on weapons, you get 100 divided by 4, or 25 tanks produced. Easy enough so far. Resetting everything, note how the budget B, minus the military spending M, is the amount of money left over, and so that is the implied outlay on social spending. However, remember how each of these has diminishing marginal returns. So the actual benefit goes up the more that is spent, but the initial return on investment is larger than the later returns. To capture the diminishing gain, we will take the square root of each of those quantities. This mimics the shape of the graph from a second ago. We could make these distinct and general functions with reasonable properties, but as good as implicit solutions to first-order conditions would be for my retention metrics, let's keep it simple for the sake of my own sanity. That said, we will maintain this V in here. Doing so allows us to scale how much you care about the military versus the homeland. It is not negative. When it equals 0, you are Monaco, and you care nothing about military affairs. The optimization problem becomes boring. On the other hand, if V is getting dangerously close to infinity, you've just taken a time machine back to World War II, and again your decision is boring. Back to the general problem. I know that this is a simplification of real budgets, but it will be a useful one for us to think through the incentives. It is just like how drawing lines on maps helps simplify complex war situations, which is then useful for understanding the real-world versions of them. Okay, you are the leader. How do you distribute those resources? You would not want to put everything into the military like this. Even if we start over, and you care 10 times more about the military outcome, say because you are in the middle of a war, those diminishing marginal returns start to bite back as you keep spending. Even if social spending does not matter much in the aggregate, the initial return on investment looks quite attractive. As such, you want to put some in both. The question then becomes how to balance the two. Calculus is cool because it allows us to immediately get an answer. Thanks, Sir Isaac Newton. And that solution is to allocate to your military a percent of your budget equal to V squared divided by the sum of T and V squared, and then put the rest on social spending. For example, if we do this in terms of millions of dollars, and suppose that a tank costs $4 million, the total budget is $1 billion with a B, and the government cares just as much about coercion as it does social spending, then we get a fifth on the military and 4/5 on social spending. Remembering the $1 billion total budget, that gives us $200 million toward the military and leaves $800 million for the public. You can fiddle around with the allocation for yourself, but Gottfried von Wilhelm Leibniz, whose parents had a very good taste in middle names, guarantees that the $200-800 million split is optimal. Going back to the general solution, Notice that as the value of the military action increases, say because you are in the middle of a war, this time the military spending goes up along with it, and social spending goes down to compensate. But that question is not the one that we are here for. Rather, we want to understand how sanctions change that calculus, starting with the reduction of military capacity. Obviously, this is going to be good for the sanctioning state, but it is actually better than it first seems. Returning to the math, let's hold the numbers constant from before, but double the cost of producing tanks, perhaps thanks to something like the restrictions on semiconductors. Clearly, going from $4 to $8 million should bring tank production down. But take a guess by how much. No, really, go ahead and type it into the comments. And no cheating. I'm curious to see what you think. Remember, before, 200 million was going there, which was good enough to produce 50 tanks. At first thought, doubling the cost might seem like it would halve the output. However, that is off by quite a bit. The government goes from putting 20% of the budget into the military to just 11%. Now the 50 tanks from before goes down to just 13, and I guess 8/9 of a tank for next year. Decimals are very annoying. In reality, those 8s go on forever. Anyway, what is happening here is that the higher costs of weapons make the marginal return on social spending look more attractive. This is why the military production does not just suffer from the higher cost. Rather, the budget also gets slashed. Thus, it is a double whammy. Less money is being spent on tanks that cost more to produce. But do not get too excited. Military effectiveness is the square root of production. Here, that is about 3.73 units of effectiveness. Before, the total effectiveness was about 7.07 comparable units. So effectiveness is indeed greater before, but doubling the cost did not quite have the consequence. This, again, is the result of the initial allotment providing the biggest bump. Despite that caveat, the diverted budget is why the Western Sanctions Coalition has focused on this strategy. Now, you might think to yourself, wait a minute, sanctions are supposed to force tank production to go down, but Russia has increased tank production since the beginning of the war. And that is true. But the trick here is V. Ever since Putin made this announcement in February 2022, the value of military outcomes for Russia has skyrocketed. Looking back at the percent of the budget on the military, yes, increasing the cost of weapons makes weapons expenditures go down, but it goes up as the importance of military outcomes increases. Basically, that has swamped the effect of sanctions. But that is not the right way to think about the effectiveness of sanctions. Rather, holding fixed the new and higher military valuations, sanctions have done their job on T. Put differently, yes, Russian armament production is up since the war began. But in the absence of sanctions making production more expensive, production numbers would have gone up even further. Meanwhile, the broader sanction strategy that the West has pursued against Russia is a general financial war. This time, the consequences will not be as promising. The effect here is that the size of the budget goes down. There is less money coming into the country, which means fewer tax rubles, and, checking our watch, a new constraint on spending. If we take the same specific numbers from before, but slash the budget in half, then yes, military spending is going down. Before, it sat at 200 million. Now it is down to 100 million. But social spending has also been slashed, from 800 million before to 400 million now. The pair of numbers decreased proportionally because of the simple square root functions used for illustration. But the more general point is that the weapons are competing with the social programs, and, unlike last time, the price of a weapon has not changed. It is still a 4. Thus, though sanctioning states would want to magically target the military spending, they cannot do that. Put differently, general economic war is a blunt tool. It does some of what you want, but also hits the social spending that you do not much care about. That is part of the reason why there have been so many exceptions to the sanctions regime on this front. Whether we are talking about continuing to permit Russian gas trade to some locations, the price cap instituted on shipments rather than an outright ban, and why allowing Russian wheat trade to lower global prices and stave off instability in North Africa and the Middle East was better than starving the Kremlin of those revenues. The final sanctioning question is what happens when you release funds, but only for humanitarian purposes. That is, the extra money is forced to go into social spending. I'll leave it to the policymakers to develop the mechanisms that actually guarantee that. Certainly, this does not always work. As an example, the list of complaints regarding the Oil for Food program is hilariously long. I'm actually having to add words to the script here just to prevent the list from flying by too fast. Fortunately, at least most of these issues here are pure corruption, rather than money for weapons. But you get the general concern. With the Iranian funds that the United States controlled, the money will sit in a bank in Qatar, and whatever Iran wants to do with the cash will have to be approved before it is released. Despite those reservations, let's look at the ideal case where the controls work perfectly. It is still not going to turn out well. Before, when the government had full control over military spending, it would select a particular M, and then put the remaining funds into the social category. Now, however, let's suppose that 100 million of it is part of the humanitarian release, so that the government-controlled budget is no longer 1,000, it is 900, and the conditional release of the funds forces 100 into the social spending. Thus, we need to compare how this modification plays out to what the budget allocation would be without the restriction. If you look closely, you can already see how this is going to be a problem. If not, well, here goes. The second case is the running example that we have been using, so we know that the division is $200 million for the tanks and $800 million for the social spending. Now imagine that the sanctioning state controls $100 million of the money. Again, the budget is down to 900, and social spending is getting 100 hammered into it by the humanitarian exception. If the sanctions regime has solved the problem, then social spending should go up, and military spending should go down, as compared to the unconstrained budget from before. And if we consult our old calculus friends, we see that sure enough, hey, wait a minute. That is exactly the same as it was before. Even the humanitarian spending ultimately equals out. What the heck happened? On a raw level, the exception did not actually change the optimization problem. The new equation is mathematically the same as the old equation, just with extra steps. Substantively, what is happening is that the fungibility train is coming through. Choo-choo, all aboard. Fungibility is the quality of a good that makes it identical and interchangeable with the same good. Houses? Not very fungible at all. Location, bedrooms, bathrooms, garage size, all of those things vary. Even cookie-cutter homes end up diverging due to the modifications that prior owners have made to the interiors. Used cars? Also not very fungible. Just think about the differences on the odometer, never mind the quality of the maintenance. New cars? They are more fungible than used ones, but even within the same make and model, they will still have notable differences in their finishes. Gasoline? Now we are talking. Very fungible. When was the last time that you asked about the origin of your fuel? My new book on the strategy of the first 16 months of the war? Also fungible. The printing company makes each copy identical, at least I hope. And no, this is not the end of the video. We still have to talk about dollars, and they are about as fungible as it gets. What maximizes the welfare of this state with $1 billion is a division of 200 million and 800 million. So when the humanitarian police comes in and tells you that you, as the leader of the country, have to spend the newly released $100 million on social programs, and social programs alone, you just spend 100 million less of the money that you control on that. Now, before the angry comments down below roll in and say, "You silly academic, fungible is a stupid word you just made up that no one would ever use in Washington or spend a moment thinking about." Well, for one thing, you cannot spell fungible without fun, so fungibility is clearly awesome. But for another, what you are witnessing is either the most exciting or most boring State Department press conference of all time, in which State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller and a reporter seen there spend minutes arguing about the fungibility, and yes, they use that exact word, of Iranian sanctions relief. It is truly riveting television, which explains why it has 4,800 views on YouTube. Come on, guys, let's get it up to 5,000, please. Anyway, this was not an isolated incident. The word pops up with disturbing regularity wherever sanctions are in the mix. Furthermore, there is a domestic analog to this within state budgets. Well, maybe not within Utah for reasons that will be clear in about 2 seconds. How about Texas? Yes. You see, this is about lotteries. Many state lotteries gather political support by having some percentage of the proceeds earmarked for public schools. Texas, for example, pays 25% of lottery revenue to the Texas Education Agency. So it is a win for school systems, right? Not so fast. Research attempting to demonstrate that has only achieved hazy results. So what the fungible is going on here? Well, the problem indeed is the fungibility of tax dollars. If the state government is forced to spend the lottery revenue on schools, they just take the money that otherwise would have been spent there and assign it to another program. And sadly, the problem is worse than I have been letting on so far. We have been comparing unconstrained billion-dollar budgets to constrained billion-dollar budgets. The point of this was to show that they are actually the same calculation. However, the relevant question for policymakers considering humanitarian exceptions is what would happen in the absence of any leniency. This is the correct way to think about relief. But the absence of relief is a $900 million total budget. We know that 200-800 is the optimal division with relief. Meanwhile, it is 180-720 without. The $20 million difference in military spending is due to the humanitarian relief. The consolation prize here is that 80 million did get properly converted. But remember that as the value of military outcomes increases, so too does the percent of the budget going there. In other words, when V is big, humanitarian relief tends to go to the wrong place in greater quantities. Thus, a war is basically the worst time for them. Now, the fun with fungibility here does not mean that humanitarian sanctions relief is inherently doomed to fail, just that it is starting behind the 8 ball. For example, rather than holding the $100 million hostage from before, imagine that the sanctioning state held $900 million. Because so much is already locked in here, now the government puts all freely available funds into the military. But despite that, you still end up with less spending on arms than would be the case with an unconstrained budget. To be clear, this is still way, way worse than what military spending would be like without any relief. All we are doing is beating the unconstrained budget benchmark. It should be noted that this is a very extreme situation, though, and does not reflect many real-world cases. Something that is more plausible is if the funds must go to a third category of spending aside from this trade-off. Maybe public health spending that the government ordinarily would not care at all about. But that assumes that there is no connection between the categories. Essentially, that each type of public spending is non-fungible. There's that word again. Once more, I am not selling NFTs here. Never. A more complicated system to set up is where the relief is conditional on the government's budget decision. For example, if the sanctioner knows that the government would spend $180 million on the military without humanitarian relief, then it can release the extra $100 million, conditional on military spending being frozen. The way that you try to enforce that is by telling the government that failure to abide by those rules will cause some kind of sanction to snap back in place. Such conditional cooperation deals are commonplace in international relations. But the problems with getting them to work in this type of situation are numerous. For one, the fact that sanctions are occurring at all indicates that some kind of bargaining has already failed between the parties. So somehow that bargaining problem must magically not be present with the enforcement part. More generally, though, good luck to a sanctioner trying to audit a government's budget to make sure that the division is being done properly. Another solution is to not release the funds directly, but rather increase the infrastructure for social spending. In other words, add a multiplier effect S, a number greater than 1, to social spending, so that each dollar spent has a greater return on investment. This is like the earlier case of increasing the cost of each tank, but in reverse. Now, this can work, and indeed does work for the square roots here. But it can also backfire. Imagine that the government just needs to make 1 million people happy to keep the government in power. Then the social spending is meant to do the minimum necessary to get to that threshold, and then move the rest of the funds onto guns. If social spending becomes more efficient, then making those 1 million people satisfied can be done for cheaper, and thereby frees up more cash for the military. So what have we learned today? Well, I guess fungibility really funges with good sanctions. And as a broader point, what makes strategic interactions interesting are not the first-order effects of a policy change. No, the interesting part is how the parties can make further calculated responses to those changes. And if the analysis you seek skips over that part, well, it probably wasn't very good to begin with. If you want to have some more fun with fungibility, don't forget to check out that aforementioned book. It has the word fungible in it exactly once. I just checked now. And no, it's still not about those stupid tokens. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. Well, for one thing, you cannot spell fun without fungible. Fungible without fun. Whoops, other way around.